Hey y'all. So today I want to talk about Jesus. So everybody go ahead and get your rage fingers ready for the comment section. Here we go. So we are now in full swing of week 1 of Advent. A little bit of background about me. I was raised by Lutherans in a Lutheran church. I even went to Lutheran camp in the late 90s. I want to say in like 1998, I made what to this day I refer to as a pretty badass Advent log at Lutheridge in Asheville, North Carolina. What? Anyway, so that's my understanding of the teachings of Christ. It comes from a pretty Lutheran perspective. So, let's talk about how Jesus would react to his name being thrown around in modern American politics. You don't have to go far, either on the internet or in the real world, or on television or on the radio or anywhere else, to find somebody who makes the argument that America is a Christian nation. That's a pretty common argument, especially where I'm from, South Carolina. It's also a pretty common argument here where I live and where I made my home in southern rural Oregon. So, let's operate under the assumption that, yeah, we are a Christian nation. Sure. Let's use that argument and assume that it is reality. If you go back and you look at the founders and the framers, many of them, like an overwhelming majority of them, came from some Christian background perspective. Varying elements of Christianity, but mostly Christian, mostly Protestant. Now, that is true. It is also important to remember the time in which they were doing their work. They were creating a nation during the height of what's referred to as the Enlightenment Period. Most of you probably know what that is, but for those of you who don't, essentially, it was the period during the mid to late 18th century and into the early 19th century that really focused on the idea that reason should take precedence over mysticism, over religion, especially when conducting civil affairs. It was an intellectual challenging of the concepts of things like divine right, which is the idea that a single monarch is chosen by God or to rule, and as a result of that, that monarch's descendants are also chosen by God to rule. And to question the legitimacy of that is to question God. Well, a lot of these Enlightenment philosophers and thinkers and writers started coming around and thought, well, wait a minute. Who says this? Because it sounds like the first mention of that is from the rulers themselves. I see no mention of that from God, not in any of the holy texts. This is also a time when that is happening in conjunction with the scientific revolution. So concepts of reason and logic and empirical evidence really come to light at this time. Okay, so moving on. The founders and the framers are highly influenced by Enlightenment thinkers and philosophers and writers. There are even a couple of Enlightenment philosophers within their ranks. One such is, of course, Benjamin Franklin. You also have people like Hobbes and Paine, who is the author of probably my favorite piece of Enlightenment writing, The Crisis, written in 1776. These are the times that try men's souls bit. So you have people like Washington. You have people like Jefferson, who won't get to him. You have people like Adams, Hamilton, Franklin. Folks who view the founding of a new republic as not just an Enlightenment affair, but yes, in a way, also a spiritual affair too. It's in the Declaration of Independence that, all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator. Now, it does not say endowed by their Creator these unalienable rights. It doesn't say which Creator, but the point is they acknowledge that their belief, and really the belief of the time, is still that there is a divine Creator. Now, this is where a lot of, we'll call them Christian nationalists, make the argument that, see, they're Christian, and they're using Judeo-Christian perspectives. This is true, they are. But they're not using this perspective as a bedrock for some sort of divine right of the country itself. In fact, they're doing this really clever thing, which I've always kind of appreciated, which is they're taking the spiritual aspect and they're using that in conjunction with this Enlightenment idea that there is still a contract between the government and the governed. And I've always thought that was really cool, and that it is the people themselves which were created and given this right to rule themselves by God instead of the government or a single person. And yeah, I've always thought that really interesting. Anyway, so, sure, I'm willing to accept that argument. You fast forward to today, and you look at what we have used that sort of Christian argument for. And I gotta wonder, what would Jesus think of all this? What would Christ think of all of this? Children in cages as a deterrent from other people seeking asylum. Well, if you read your Bible, you know that baby Jesus was a refugee. They fled to Egypt for a time. Or the continued pressing the thumb down on oppressed minorities. Well, Jesus made a pretty important example of why we should treat everybody with dignity and respect. It's called, regardless of any sort of cultural differences, it's called the Good Samaritan. Or our treatment of those who are sick, either physically or mentally or what have you. Well, yeah, he literally was a healer. You could look to our treatment of people who are you can call them statistics of recidivism. People who commit crimes, people who are mentally ill, people who are either incapable or not in the place to really act upon societal norms. Well, Jesus was often criticized for sitting and eating with these people. You could look to our current government's ingratiating and enriching of megachurches that don't pay taxes, yet their facilities and their leaders bring in literal millions of dollars every year. Well, I think Christ said something along the lines of, "You have turned my Father's house into a den of thieves." My point is, going into the season of the holy days, the Christmas season, which, by the way, there is no war on. I'm just going to go ahead and put that one to rest too. Going into this season, especially this year, I think it's important to remember the guy that we're celebrating. Because the whole point of the founders and the framers was almost exact to the point of Christ, which was throwing a wrench into the ideological status quo. Flipping the script. Challenging the accepted norms of thought. That's what the framers did. What we have that we take for granted as something that's lasted for a long time and that will always last and that was, divined by God, was a very new thing. And by all means should not have worked. But it did. And it did so on the backs of a lot of people who greatly suffered for us to have what we have today. Even for me to be able to make this video that might not get a single viewer. So too did Christ flip the script, throw a wrench in the societal discourse of how things ought to be at the time. The two dominant religions in the region of Judea at the time were Judaism, of course, and then the Roman state religion. And, excuse me, Christ, he challenged both of those. Christ challenged the idea that it was a contract between the people and the religion. And he also challenged the idea that it was a contract between the people and the state. And in both of those challenges, he also challenged the notion that both of those were one-way contracts. Instead, Christ made the argument, not just through his words, but also his actions, that the relationship goes between God and people, and that relationship is manifested in how we treat each other, in how we show love to one another, not how we try to subjugate other people. Christ wasn't a trust fund baby. He wasn't anybody with a really notable name. I mean, unless you count the notion that he was from a broken royal line. No, he was some kid born out of wedlock, raised by a carpenter, and went on to become one of the single most important human beings to ever exist, divine or not. His divinity is irrelevant. It was his actions, his words, and how his actions and words impacted the world. That's what I focus on. And I have to say, I fundamentally believe, going into this holy day season, I fundamentally believe that if Christ were alive today, preaching the same things that he preached 2,000 years ago, if he came back and preached those things again, the institution of Christian nationalism in the United States would overwhelmingly and ravenously call for his execution, all in the name of Christ. It's something to think about. We have an opportunity this year, of all years, this year, to flip the script. We have an opportunity to throw a wrench in the social discourse of how things ought to be. We have an opportunity to do what the framers and the founders did, but better. We have an opportunity to do what Christ told us to do, which is to love each other, to show each other care. It's something that I would challenge not just anyone watching this, but also myself to do. Because of all years, this year, I think that we owe that. Not just to Christ or our country or anything like that, but to each other and ourselves. So, that's pretty much it. Thank you for listening to my rant. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and happy holy days. Bye, y'all.